Hi, everyone, and welcome to this mini lecture on curricula. It's a bit on the long side, so please hang in there with me. The goal of this presentation is for you to gain an understanding of what curricula are and to have a simple framework for thinking about and analyzing them a bit more closely. So, what is a curriculum? The textbook authors Kaplan and Owings define a curriculum as all the learning that is planned and guided by the school, whether it is carried on in groups or individually, inside or outside the school. A curriculum is a plan for learning. And we can distinguish curricula from pedagogy, which is more about instruction and will be covered in another lecture. I like to think about it this way. Curriculum is the what, and pedagogy is the how of teaching. By now, you have probably heard the terms educated and schooled used somewhat interchangeably. Let's take a moment to consider how we use these two terms and what they mean. By educated, we usually mean learning that is ongoing. It can be in or out of a formal school program. Sometimes being educated points toward real world practical knowledge and experience. Someone we deem to be educated is usually someone who can do something with what they know. They may or may not be formally schooled. We might call them wise or street smart. On the other hand, being schooled usually means having attended a formal program. For example, I was schooled at VCU on how to become a teacher. Being schooled does not necessarily mean I can do the work of being a good teacher, only that I got my degree or credential because I completed a formal program. Schooling is usually very defined, occurring in a specific place and time. I like to think of these two ideas as being on a continuum that reflects an underlying purpose for education to school or produce data and outcomes such as test scores, degrees, and credentials, which we know are very important, but also to be educated or to prepare students with practical skills for life beyond the classroom. Some scholars argue that the shift to standards based instruction is a shift more toward schooling rather than educating our youth, that these curricula are subject centered and not student centered. Still, other scholars argue that standards are necessary to ensure that all children receive a rigorous and quality education. Let's keep this continuum idea in mind for a moment and consider the social influences on curricula. As we know from our studies in this course, there are many influences on public education, and curriculum is no exception. The three big influences we've discussed in this course are the government, the economy, and religion. We might say curricula are never neutral, but always influenced by someone or some group that makes a values-based decision on what to include and what not to include. According to our textbook authors, curricular approaches have swung between two ends of a continuum, from subject-centered to student or learner-centered. So, we are going to take a closer look at 5 scholars who have influenced American curricula. But first, let's look at this framework and keep it in mind as we try to determine whether the scholars' work is taking a subject-centered or learner-centered approach. And because we're digging a bit deeper, let's think about the philosophy of education expressed in their work. A subject-centered curriculum begins with content and ideas, and it points more toward a traditional philosophy. Whereas a learner-centered curriculum, which begins by thinking about the learner, his or her experiences, is pointing more towards a progressive philosophy. It's not that one is good and the other is bad, but that we're stepping back and using this framework to analyze curricula. For instance, we can have a learner-centered curriculum that is more about schooling, teaching and measuring learning with testing that is decontextualized from practical applications. We could also have a subject-centered curricula that aims to educate students to prepare them for practical outside of the classroom applications. But why do we even care about this at all? Let's think about teacher preparation for a moment. Do we expect a teacher prep curriculum to be subject or learner centered? I'm going to say subject centered because there are important things that teachers need to know to do their jobs. They need to learn about curricula and pedagogy and child development. They must become experts in their content area. But do we want them to be only schooled or do we want them to be educated? We want our teachers to have more than a degree and license. We want them to be educated so that they can apply what they've learned and put it into practice in the classroom pretty much right away. So maybe we would expect a subject-centered, educated curriculum. I'm going to put an X in this quadrant for my opinion on what we might expect from a teacher prep curriculum. But this is my opinion. Let's use this framework to analyze the 5 examples from our textbook. Ralph Tyler's rationale is described as one that implicitly considers the learner and recommends curriculum writers address these 4 questions in their design. What is the purpose of education in this curriculum? What kind of educational experiences does it offer the learner? How will these experiences be organized, and how will learning be assessed? Tyler's rationale considers not only the content, but the pedagogy or the how content will be delivered. This rationale focuses on learning experiences of students and how activities will not only construct meaning, but can be used to measure outcomes. So let's put our framework to use with Tyler's rationale. I said that Tyler begins with how the student will experience content and how that experience creates learning. So I'm leaning toward a learner-centered philosophy. Tyler was also focused on how learning will be assessed more so than how it will be used beyond the classroom. So I'm leaning toward a schooled purpose. I'm going to put Tyler's rationale here. Let's move on to another example. Hilda Taba was influenced by Tyler as well as cognitive psychology. She developed a 7-step model that begins by diagnosing need. She considers both the content and the learner and believes in teaching durable forms of knowledge, or that which is concept-driven. I think of this kind of knowledge as contextualized, as knowledge in use. Taba's model is described as taking a constructivist approach. Constructivism means learning through experiences and active meaning making. Learning is about putting the knowledge to use rather than passively receiving information. So let's put the framework to use here with Taba's model. I said her model is described as constructivist, which is about putting knowledge into practice. So I'm leaning toward the educated end of the purpose curriculum. Taba's model was also described as both subject and learner focused, so it's more in the middle on the philosophy continuum. I would put Taba's model here. Of course, if we had an actual curriculum to analyze, we might find the big red X moving toward one or the other end of the continua. We are only working at a high level here and using this as an example. Let's try another. Next, we have Bloom. Anyone who has taken an education course before has likely encountered Benjamin Bloom's 1956 taxonomy, which was later revised. Bloom's taxonomy, as it is known, develops increasingly complex levels of understanding and learning organized in a framework or taxonomy. Bloom and his colleagues were concerned with teaching for transfer, or how what is learned is used to answer questions or solve problems. this lovely colorful pyramid, which I hope you will now and forevermore recognize as something you learned about in your education courses, is a method for classifying educational objectives, experiences, and processes. For example, this mini lecture is pretty low on the taxonomy. You are passively listening to and hopefully building an understanding of this content. But understanding is down there near the bottom, right? Lower cognitive demand. But if you were asked to, say, evaluate a curriculum using the framework and information from this lecture, you would need to remember and understand, apply, analyze in order to evaluate the curriculum. The higher up the pyramid we go, the more cognitively demanding the task. And each level on the pyramid includes those below it. Evaluating includes analyzing and applying, and so forth. The taxonomy is still widely used today as a way to help teachers select content and design instructional activities to increase and strengthen students' cognitive skills. So, let's apply our framework to Bloom's taxonomy. I said Bloom's is about the cognitive demand placed on the learner. When I hear cognitive, I start to lean toward schooling. But depending on what task or question or problem the student was doing, we might be closer to the educated end of the purpose continuum. And the taxonomy was focused on the task or what the student was doing, which makes me lean more toward a learner-centered philosophy. So I would put Bloom here. Of course, again, we are not analyzing an actual curriculum yet, and if we had an actual text, it might steer us in a different direction. The fourth of our 5 examples is Wiggins and McTeague's backward design, which is based on the idea that curriculum is a blueprint for learning and that learning is derived from content and performance standards. A curriculum shapes content into a plan for effective teaching and learning and considers both the learner and the desired outcomes. Rather than first deciding what to teach, then teaching it, and then assessing it, Wiggins and McTeague's backward design begins with the desired outcomes. This design works well when we incorporate standards because standards provide us with the targeted outcome. Backward design is very much about what students do and that learning occurs by doing. Because of this, it is also considered to be a constructivist approach. So, let's try out our framework with backward design. I said that backward design begins with ideas, objectives, and outcomes. When I hear the word ideas, it makes me lean toward a subject-centered end of the philosophy continuum. As well, when I hear the words objectives and outcomes, that makes me lean toward the schooling end of the purpose continuum. But their design is also described as constructivist, which means active experiences, or that which is closer maybe to the educated end of the purpose continuum. So I'm putting backward design here, somewhat closer to subject-centered and slightly closer to educated, but still kind of in the middle. Again, this might be different if we were analyzing an actual backward design curriculum. Let's try this one more time. Our 5th example of a scholar who's influenced American curriculum is Lisa Delpit and her work, which is often referred to as Other People's Children, which was the title of a very famous article she wrote. Her work is on culture and the power differentials between teachers and students and between the dominant culture and students' cultures. Delpit believes that all children should be taught the codes and rules of the dominant culture so that they can access that culture's discourses and become successful. But this is to be done in a way that does not erase students' voices and cultures. Following this mini lecture, you have an optional view of a short video on Lisa Delpit's work. I highly encourage you to spend a little more time learning about it. So let's try out our framework one last time with Lisa Delpit's work. When I hear the words power relations and dominant culture, I right away think critical philosophy. But that doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's a subject or learner-centered philosophy. We might be tempted to lean toward a learner-centered philosophy, but Delpit is also focused on teaching the codes and rules of a dominant culture. And this tells me it is about content. Additionally, her work does not fit nicely into our continuum. Delpit is concerned with minority children accessing dominant culture to ultimately catch up to their white middle-class peers. Does catch up mean test scores and achievement outcomes? And we know those are very real and have very real implications. So I'm leaning more towards a schooling purpose. I'm going to put my X here for Lisa Delpit's work, but this is a tricky one, wouldn't you agree? We might do better if we had an actual curriculum to analyze. What's important is that we justify our answers with reasoning and evidence. So, our society continues to struggle in the search for balance when it comes to curriculum and what to teach our children. As well, we continue to struggle in the way we define our purpose for education. Do we want to school our youth? Are we focused on outcomes and numbers? Or do we want them to be educated members of the society? Like most of my mini lectures, I'm going to leave you here equipped with the simple framework and some understanding so that you can access the discourse of power on public school curricula.